Okay, so today's episode of the Protagonistas, we are chatting with Alyssa Aldape about, and this is so exciting because I've never actually done like a, I don't know, cultural commentary on a Disney movie, but we'll be talking about Encanto. So I'm so excited, Alyssa. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Kat. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I was just so fascinated. First of all, not just with this movie because I literally just saw it, so I'm like dealing with a newborn, and I'm like I watch things in like
The best
literal
movie.
5 minute increments. Yeah. So but we're all we're in a group chat, us and with some other Latinas, and I was just fascinated reading the conversations and having not seen the movie and then finally seeing the movie, and like I went back and like, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. So anyway, I was really excited to talk about this movie because I feel like there are so many wonderful and also not so wonderful things to talk about it and to tease out about it. And it's always so fun to do that. And I especially wanted to speak with you because you make such a wonderful connection with the movie and the church. And we'll talk about that toward the end. And so I want to also kind of, look at it theologically. So before we talk about Encanto, I would love for you to share with us about your spiritual background, to tell us about, just tell us about yourself, your spiritual and cultural background, and where your journey to where you are right now.
Yeah. So I grew up in Texas. Sorry, I just like took a big old coffee and okay, so grew up in Texas, in South Texas, born and raised there. Was raised in the Hispanic Baptist Church. It's some of my first memories. My dad was an associate pastor for years. It's the place that taught me how to love God and how to be like Jesus. They went to GA's Girls in Action on Wednesday nights to learn about white missionaries and all the good that they did across the world. It was the formative years of my faith. It was the Hispanic Baptist Church in Texas, which, and if you don't really know the history behind it, it has, the foundations of the Hispanic Baptist Church, are rooted in, some racism and some white supremacy, in that, there was a mission for Baptists to come down and convert the heathen Catholics in Texas. And so then we eventually outnumbered them. And so then they created, like, heaven forbid we all worship together. So then Hispanic Baptists were created. You got to love it. And so it's very funny, like when you grow up in Texas, particularly as, Latino, you, in big major cities in Texas, you have First Baptist Church, it's whatever. But then there's also First Mexican Baptist Church, because let's just broaden that even more.
Right.
It's just all Mexican. So First Mexican Baptist Church of San Antonio, that's where I went. And then it's all just called Primera. Like everybody just called it Primera. Like, oh yeah, I go to Primera in San Antonio. Like I go to Primera Dallas. So like that was a whole thing, and which was very mind blowing that no one else had that outside of Texas growing up.
Right.
And I think for me, growing up Mexican in primarily San Antonio, South Texas, there was a lot of pulses that we kind of common things that we all shared, right? Like, oh, we all speak Spanish, we speak this form of Tex-Mex, we share these parts of culture, but then at the same time, because like faith is so tied into our culture, there were aspects of it that I didn't really understand, because for my family, my mom, when they came to the US, there was this evangelical pastor who was trying to convert my grandfather, and then they did, and it was almost as if to become a Baptist for them was to leave behind part of their culture and identity.
Right.
In Mexico. And for them it was a bright light, and it was a bastion for them. And also I think for me it was a loss of culture that we weren't able to grow up with.
Right.
As then the children of
Right.
our parents who immigrated here. And so there was kind of realizing that more towards like my later years, 10, 11, 12, and seeing like, oh, when something was deemed, oh, that's Catholic, we don't do that. that's idol worship. Oh my God.
Right.
I cannot believe like in church, there would be like a señora who, or like an hermana, that's what we call them in church. I'm like, oh, an hermana, we're like, that's Catholic. And why
Right.
would you, what would she like, why would you worship the nurse when you could, when the doctor is right there? And I was like, okay, but like my mom's a nurse. That's mean. So that was the upbringing that I came into, was, you know, this tension, even within my own faith and culture. Of trying to find identity and leaning into it, and also recognizing the missing pieces within it. And then even within, you know, the culture, recognizing that there was very much there was a power at play within, you know, people within our communities who were here legally, or con papeles, or who weren't, and knowing how that was a big power dynamic for grown-ups. And so so growing up within that, while also being told by these same adults, oh, Jesus is love and God is love. Right. Like, oh, okay. So grew up in Texas. My parents eventually became missionaries themselves. And we moved to India when I was 13, grew up in India, which was another place where faith really came to a crossroad for me as a person, which was interesting, as a person of color who grew up in America, right, where, you know, this was a Christian nation, and then going to a place where, hey, you know, maybe your faith doesn't get everything right, and being asked to, you know, look in the mirror of Christianity, and like, oh, hey, maybe this didn't get everything right. And what are the ways that, you know, what are the critiques that people actually have that are fair and true and honest, which I think was, you know, for me, I was very thankful for that experience. So yeah, when I grew up in India, that was a big part of my faith journey for me. And then came back to America for college, decided to go to school in the South. I don't know why, like all good missionary kids go to Baylor. And I was like, I'm going to be a rebel. And I'm going to go to Stanford, which is basically small Baylor. So went to Stanford, was another just encounter of like, wait, I thought this was, you know, my understanding of Christianity, again, because it was just very experiencing American Christianity, or in that context, was very limited. And so coming back to it and being very shocked by essentially blatant racism, and, you know, underlying and blatant, and for my understanding of, you know, well, we affirm all people, but never seeing it in practice, I think was, and I know any young person comes to that point of recognizing the cracks in the institutions of their faith. But to see both the cracks that everyone, that, you know, that my peers were seeing, my white peers saw, while also trying to point out the casual racism taking place, was difficult. That was, I think, for me, a point where, you know, I had to ask myself, am I willing to just kind of, okay, well, maybe those people were just having a bad day, or maybe they're just not like that, or maybe they are just old. Or was I going to say, no, this isn't right, and we shouldn't be putting up with this. So that's kind of always been, you know, a part of my faith journey, was really understanding how power was at play, within the community, within the scriptures that I was taught, the stories that I was taught, and then within my own life, and recognizing where my own power was and is. And, you know, now as a person who I worked in churches for almost 10 years. And then in March, I decided to step back from church work, and, you know, trying to figure out what is next. But still also recognizing, you know, if we truly believe God is not done speaking, then I have to believe that for myself and for my life. So still navigating that, while also trying to hold true to the understanding that God is bigger than, you know, than any type of concept of what calling is and what faith is, or how I or any other person can define it, but still just as close to say, you know, what is true is good and loving. And so, I hope that's like an easy, like in a nutshell, that's my faith life. That's my testimony.
I like literally have so many follow-up questions that I feel like we're not even going to get to Encanto. So I will I will want to, just ask you a couple. I'm so
Yeah,
interested how you talk about power, and I'm just so interested in your it's funny because you say formative years, but like what really is formative years? All of it's formative, but like
you're right. It's all.
right. But like your time in a Hispanic church and like being basically part of an immigrant community in the US and formulating your identity and your faith in a very complicated space, and then moving to India, and then also, I mean, because there's so much at play there, considering that you are also part of a non-dominant culture in India, but the power dynamics there because you guys are missionaries. And so you mentioned power and how you've just, because that is a difficult thing to, we have, I feel like power, the same thing with privilege, like it's constantly moving, like our, we have varying levels of privilege, and in some places I have more power than I do in others. And so it's this thing that we're always having to understand and reevaluate. And so I just want to hear more about that transition from being part of an immigrant community in Texas to then moving to India and then moving back. What was
Yeah.
that sort of like?
So, and I would say, like, even within, our family was so involved in church, like, I mean, so involved. I didn't understand that people did things other than church on Wednesday nights
Mm-hmm.
until we started going to white church. When they were like, oh, we're just not going today. I was like, you're just not going on a Wednesday? Okay. See if your name gets called out of the book. But like, it was so, and I will say it was an immigrant community in that, so many of us came from a family of immigrants, whether it was 3 generations back, 1 generation
Right.
back, or ourselves were immigrant. I'm first generation. There were kids who would show up in Sunday school who like had just gotten here, and they're like, they don't speak English. I'm like, okay,
Right.
so we're doing Sunday school in Tex-Mex today. And it was a very fascinating place because even within that community, power was at play with,
Oh, yeah.
whether if there was somebody in the church who said, I don't really like what's happening, can we change this? Maybe someone who had more privilege, legally or not, could say, could threaten them and say, oh, you don't like what's happening here? You know what? I don't like when people are here like, it was just so wild that was even within our own community happening. And I say it is a complicated relationship because we were, the understanding of Christianity we had, like, we also had pictures of white Jesus in our church. And so there was still this sense of the proximity to whiteness was considered good and holy. And maybe necessarily, it wasn't said out loud. It wasn't said, by Sunday school teachers. That's not like found in the Bible, but there were, the girls who could pass as white got to play Mary, or the family who had green eyes and who had lighter brown hair, we're just so much prettier. And so it was definitely still in the culture. And I know all of there are many communities and in our Latin communities who deal with colorism and the obsession with the proximity to whiteness. And so that was a fascinating piece to that. And again, recognizing the power, like, okay, well, in this bigger context, we are people of color, we are Latinos, it is still a very white culture, but knowing the power that we held within those circles. And then, again, moving to India, it was always interesting because, the people would assume like, oh, you're American, therefore you have X, Y, and Z. And like, actually, no, if you actually put me back in America, I don't have X, Y. Maybe I have X and Z, or maybe not Y. And so, again, grappling with, the layers of privilege, and recognizing, well, yes and no, and just understanding the layers that come with that. And so that India was a good place, it was an interesting place to be as the child of missionaries, because it was very interesting that people assumed my brother and I were both there as doing the same thing my parents were doing. It was like, no, we're the codependents. And navigating that with other young people who went to Catholic schools there and who said, oh, this is my understanding of what Christianity is. And it wasn't a good one. And navigating that and having to really sit with my own belief system, and there are actually harms that it has done, not just to me personally, but to other people. And what does it mean to be a person of Christ, and what does it mean to be saved? Like, that was, I mean, being in India was the first place that realizing or understanding the idea of salvation and being saved, I really had to sit with and think for myself, is this something that I think the God I was taught about, who is a loving God, really truly wants us to do, and in the manner in which we're doing it. So yeah, yeah. And so then, going to college in the South, where, again, I think the rate, in Texas, I never experienced, I mean, I'm microaggressions, I'm sure. But I think going to a school in the South, in Alabama, in Birmingham, with its own history of racism, and learning the history, in more in-depth understanding of what happened there and what took place, and seeing how quickly people say, well, we're over that now, because we're over that. But kind of seeing it again, the power dynamic play out, in the way jobs were, the way people were represented in jobs and in schools and in structures. I was like, are y'all sure we're over this now? Because it don't look like it is. And yeah, and again, seeing that come from a Christian standpoint, of people who were like, well, we all love God here. I'm like, but not that's not my understanding of how we're supposed to love God. It was an interesting, again, just playing on of power, and what does it mean to wield it and use it.
Right. Yeah, it really does seem like you've had to wrestle with your identity in multiple ways in a lot of different spaces. And so I'm sure that there's been so much there in a lot of different areas, and in a lot of different ways. And so that's so interesting. Like I said, I wish I could ask you so many more follow-up questions, but I do want to talk about Encanto. Yes. Maybe we'll do a part 2. Okay, so you wrote an opinion piece on Encanto, which I thought was really good, just kind of wrestling with it. And I'm sure that there was so much more that you wanted to say. So let's start with, well, first I just wanted to ask, do you identify with any of the characters of the story?
I don't know what you're talking about.
I was planning on Instagram to post the picture, the side by side that you did.
Oh my God. When that, and I even texted in the group chat when we were chatting about it. And I was like, I know this is important stuff happening. And also, wow, huge moment for brown girls with curly hair and glasses, but that's not the point here.
Really,
no, when she comes out in the movie, my fiance, Nick, he just kept looking at me, and he's like, do you see what I see? I don't know what you're talking about. Nope. And I fangirling all over the place. Finally, we have our own version of a princess. Multiple princesses, actually, in my opinion.
Female characters for sure.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this because I don't know if you've seen people have really had some nerve in the last few weeks of making Enneagram charts of Encanto characters, which was a very white thing to do, in my opinion. And I was like, please don't do that. Not yet. Let's just not right now. But I think any child of immigrants can relate to, in any aspect, a lot of the different grandchildren or children in that movie. Because I was like, okay, in reality, I look like Mirabel, I get it, but also I'm actually Pepa, and just the way I let my emotions just you know what, this is how I feel, and I'm gonna be okay with my tears and how big they get, or how big my feelings get. But I think Mirabel, her character is just, I think right now, for where I am in life, I just could relate to her in this sense of, I think in the movie, every character has this gift, right? And every character has this gift, and they lean into it, and it becomes their identity, and who they are. And, in the movie, we learned that Mirabel she didn't get a gift, or in the sense that she didn't get her door, she didn't get the glowing light, the way her cousins and her aunts and uncles and mother did. And she has to live with that truth while everyone around her tells her in word, oh, it's fine, everything's fine, you're still part of us, like you're still, all are welcome, you're still welcome here. And yet in that scene when everyone takes that picture and she is just left out of it, oh my god. And so so it's this person who's trying to navigate, well, what does it mean to be told to be welcome, that I'm welcome here, but also really not in practice. And then in a way seeing the cracks in the ways that this system that she's told is perfect because it's wonderful and it's a beautiful celebration, and she's like, well, and also it's also this.
I got goosebumps. Like her ability to see the cracks in the system that's not working. That's really good. It's really, really good. And did I interrupt you? Or were you going to say something else?
No, that was just Mirabel.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. So you say, and I want to talk a little bit more about those gifts, or a little bit more about, kind of teasing that out a bit. You say Mirabel's gift, it turns out, is the gift of truth and tending. She finds a way to guide her family into their truth while also helping them explore ideas they would not have otherwise. Can you talk to me a little bit about that, about this idea of truth and tending, and the gift that she maybe doesn't even or she doesn't realize she has, that we see throughout the movie?
Yeah. So I think the scene, because on my like 6th or 7th time watching it,
I love how you just throw that in there, on my 6th or 7th time watching.
I've watched it so many times, mostly because I was doing it for the article, and then also I was like, okay, I just want to like listen to the soundtrack again while also watching the movie. There was a particular scene that just kind of clicked for me with that when I sent it to the group chat. It's when her cousin Antonio is getting his gift, and he's so scared, and he's like, I need you. And so like, she walks up and she holds his hand, and I'm just like gonna tear up because it was the sweetest moment. But seeing how she does that for each character, like whether it was Antonio or Isabella, where she or her other sister Luisa, where she walks beside them as she's like, hey, I'm sensing something here beyond what people identify you as, or see you as. What is it? And so she slowly walks with them in their lives, and kind of helping them bring out what they're trying to name, and things that they haven't been able to say out loud. And so seeing her do that for her cousins and her sister, I think that's when it clicked for me. It was like, no, this is her gift. It is her gift to allow people to dream. She's able to tend that for them, and to help her, particularly for her older sister, for the sisters, for the women, who are finally able to say, like, I'm just so stressed, I can't carry this anymore. And the other one says, I'm supposed, like, is my only gift supposed to be that I'm beautiful? Like, I don't want to just do that. And to allow women in these contexts to be able to say that was just like, Mirabel's gift is much more powerful than I think we've given her credit for.
Yeah, exactly. So you use the phrase, or I guess the words, calling doula, to sort of describe. And I thought that was, and I had read that before I watched the movie, and I was like, ooh, that is so powerful. She's a calling doula. Can you talk to me a little bit about that, and also just the notion of identity within that, within calling, just this idea of calling, and also because I feel like calling is complicated. There's so many different ways that we can think about it and talk about it. I think that to think of like what I've said in the past, and I don't think it necessarily applies to this, but I think a lot of Western, or maybe even like white European sort of idea of calling can be very privileged, right? Like, oh, what's my calling? When it's like, well, for a lot of people, they don't have that privilege. Like, they're just surviving, like my calling is to survive, my calling is to feed my family. And so I think that that's sort of how I've thought about calling. But then also in this light, I think it is beautiful and it is challenging that it is in the context of, a Latino community, and how people do have specific things that it may not be called calling, but many things that they're expected, many expectations, or, a lot of these things. So anyway, I thought that was really beautiful how, you know, how you use calling doula and turning that around and saying, no, but like people have gifts, and it's a gift of hers to call out those gifts in others. Like we need those people in our communities, in our lives, and in the church, and we need those people that are going to like kind of lead people in that. So talk to me a little bit about that, about
Yeah.
calling doula, identity, all of that.
Yeah, so I will say it came from, I wrote a journal article a few months ago about calling. One, because for me, working that out for myself, and like, what is calling, especially after leaving church work. And like I've mentioned, when I think so many of us, we have been taught or maybe conditioned to think that church calling, being a pastor, is a lifelong thing. It is what you're supposed to like. It is the only thing it becomes your personality. It's the only thing you're allowed to identify as. And again, it's one of those things that we say in practice when somebody steps back from that or says, I'm leaving. In practice, in word, we say, oh, that's a brave thing to do. It's fine. It's good. And then also, but in practice, I don't think we really practice that well. I think it's still seen as, to leave that calling is to be a failure in some way. And, I think we have done a harm to people when we say your only calling is to do this one very specific thing. And so in this article, I breaking that down and like, what is calling? I never got my mountaintop experience where I was told exactly what to do. But what I have had has been people in my life who have tended to me and have seen my gifts and have been advocates for me in ways that I couldn't necessarily see for myself yet. And so like, is it a mountaintop experience, or is it a midwife, or really is it a doula, a person who is holding our hand as we do the real hard work of discovering and discerning and imagining who we could be. And so, for me, I think that is why the concept of doula was so important. And I say that I say that as a person who has never given birth, who's never, been a doula, but knowing so many people who have done that or who have been a doula for others. And then knowing that doula is more than just birthing. There are abortion doulas, there are death doulas. And to know that there is a person who guides and tends to the person crossing some sort of threshold. I think that's such a sacred thing to do. And I think it's, for me, I think that was an important piece of what is calling. Is it us individually only understanding it for our own individual selves, or is this, or is calling, are we all calling doulas in a way that, it takes community to help us imagine and discern and name things that we wouldn't have named ourselves, right? If we didn't have someone there to advocate for us, or to tend to us, or help draw those words or feelings out. Yeah. And so there was a part, I think it's the end song, where I think Abuela says, you are more than your gift. And again, going back to the concept of the sisters, where, Luisa was just strong, right? She's just strong. That's her thing. But she could also be kind and soft and funny. And the other sister, Isabella, who's pretty, she's the pretty one. And I mean, if you've grown, I know in my own experience, there was this sense of you couldn't be both and of something, right? Like for girls, for women, one, if you were the pretty one, that was like, oh, you've made it. You are pretty. Right. You've made it. You're gonna hit the jackpot in, all things that women are expected to do. But you also couldn't be strong. And so I think to see ways that both of them and all of the women, really everyone, not just the women, everyone could be something beyond what their gift was. I think that's beautiful, and I think is an important message for anyone. You are beyond what the world has told you you're supposed to be. You're beyond what the world's definition of calling or gift is, which I think is important, especially now, especially right now during this great resignation where everyone is, at home, has more time to sit and think. Well, I guess in the first part of the pandemic where we all had more time to sit and think about what we're doing with our lives and what we're doing with the work that we put into the world, and so, or the things that we give into the world. And so, people were saying, is this what I want to do? Is this my one thing? And so seeing people do that, whether and discerning that in group chats, in, on Marco Polos with their friends, or in text, like seeing people work that out, is such an important, I think, thing that we need, particularly in faith circles. It's important to talk about.
Yeah, that's so good. I love how you initially started talking about calling, and how, we have this idea that calling is like this one thing that we have to do and that doesn't change. And, obviously that's not the case, right? Like we're, as you just mentioned, we are transforming and becoming. And I think that coincides perfectly with this idea that like no one person is one thing, because as we're evolving and developing, like she's not just strong, right? Like she's all these other things, as you mentioned. And I think that just goes well with, as we evolve and change, so does our quote unquote calling, or what we're supposed to be doing. And these are constantly evolving dynamics, because we are evolving people, and our faith is evolving, and our, we're stepping in and out of different seasons and different things. And, as I just had a baby. And so many things in my life are going to change. And so therefore, so I love that it's this idea that, it's almost like this sacred, constant thing that God is within that. And I love that you mentioned, and it happens in community, right? Like, you're evolving as people are calling out, hey, you've changed in this way, or hey, I see this developing in you, or hey, you've grown so much in this area. I think about how much I've changed as I've healed from childhood, this or that, or and so many things start to become or just change in my life. And so I think that that's beautiful, this idea of an evolving calling, and also like just an evolving identity. And how we do see that in the movie, how people are, they change, and not necessarily they stop being strong, but they're more than that. As yeah, that's so good. And I so loved this image that you mentioned of how the doula is a sacred thing. I think, the same thing, thinking about midwifery and all these people who are, helping to draw out and helping to call out things, or helping to walk people through hard moments. And I'm wondering, do you think that the church doesn't see that as important as other things, or where's that disconnect? Because we understand those to be so sacred things, but what would you think, or what's, I don't know, sort of just your opinion on that? I'm genuinely just want to know what you have to say on that. Like, where's that disconnect, or why is that disconnect?
Ooh, Kat, this needs to be like a whole part two. Or like just like a series. I think so. For me, the way, in the article, I did write about, it was about diversity in like the church. I wrote about how the church was kind of in a way the casita, because of I think for the last 10 years, right, we've been saying the church is in decline. There's every 6 weeks, there's like a Pew Research study about how it's in decline, or how this particular group of the population is leaving the church, or this one's coming back. But I think for the most part, we, the royal we, the Church of Jesus Christ, I think there has been more a concern about protecting the institution of the church than there has been the people. And if it was about the people that we're protecting, it is about the people who wield the power, who are essentially still protecting the institution, right? And so I think there are good intentions. I want to believe that there are good intentions in that. But it goes back to power, and it goes back to, are we willing to redistribute that power? Are we willing to relinquish it for the people that God has reminded us time and time again? It's the ones who we don't think of as powerful are the ones who Jesus has told us those are the ones we should consider blessed, or be considered those who inherit the kingdom. And I think we're really scared of that. I think we are really scared of relinquishing what power we have remaining. And as a result, that light, that magic, whatever you want to call it, that has kept us alive and has kept us unified, is starting to fade, and it's starting to crumble. And we are unwilling to see the magic in how what we see as magic is we consider it devious. We consider it divisive before we say, maybe this is God telling us it's time to change, or it's time to relinquish power. And so, for the church, I have so much hope. I really do. And I think because I, believe that we are Easter people, right? We know that we believe that something must die in order to create new life. And I think when people hear me say it is time to burn what we understand as the church down and let it, and, give it new life, there's a lot that we need to give up when we do that. And I will be the first to admit that what that looks like, what that rebirth looks like, is very scary, and I can't imagine most of it. And so I imagine for someone who gives their life to protecting an institution is just as scared, if not more scared. And so I think that's why, for me, having it in the context of a Disney movie where you could sing a song about, we don't talk about this. So no, we're not going to talk about it. It felt much better to think of it this way. But I think, that's where I'm at with understanding where we are as the church right now, and seeing where we could be, and having so much hope for that. And looking for those people who can draw that out of us.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. When you talk about those with the least amount of power, are the most powerful in many ways. And that I feel like is exactly the description of what you would say someone who a doula, someone who is calling that out. I mean, they're, quote unquote, are essentially in the background, but not really, they're the ones doing the heavy labor. I think of, an abuelita theology type of, thing.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, I mentioned abuelita theology. So I'm kind of like, should I talk about the abuela? Because I want to talk about the complicated dynamics of abuelas. But also you're talking so much about the church, and I feel like this also goes well with the question I want to ask. So I'll just go into the church, and then we'll kind of end with talking about abuela. So I love how you, in your article, you connect La Casita to the church. You call the church, or let me see what I said. You said, if the Church of Jesus Christ is the casita, then the cracks have started to show in the foundation. And you're essentially talking about this idea of diversity and representation. And so I'll go ahead and just quote the whole quote. You say, how often have we heard churches yearn to be welcoming and diverse places for all people? And how often has the church missed the mark by either tokenizing one leader or only highlighting the diversity on Pentecost Sunday during the Acts 2 reading, while casting misfits out because they don't quite fit in, that made me think of Bruno also. Disney and downtown churches can learn a lot about what it means to think critically and with the intention of creating a diverse representation of the world. So that's where you say, if the church, Jesus Christ is the casita, then the cracks have started to show in the foundation. Will we continue to miss the mark, or will we see the magic in each person while truly learning what that means? Can you talk to us a little bit about the church as La Casita? I know you kind of just did, but if you want to, talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I mean, again, this goes back to, if we, I think there's two things happening, or there are multiple things, but for me, one of the big things happening is, okay, we see an issue happening within the church, right? Within the faith community, our faith communities. And there are those who are going to say, no, nothing's wrong. We just need to continue doing exactly what we've been doing for the last 30 years, 70 years, 100 years, 500 years. And we're like, everything needs to just stay the same. And then I see that, okay, well, let's do something about it. And again, I want to hope that there were good intentions behind these things, right? And so that's how we've had, so we got community centers. It's how we got fog machines and, Jesus is my boyfriend music. I don't know. Like, there were ways that we were trying to connect to culture, or to connect and say, look, we can reimagine what our faith looks like. And I think they were all responses out of fear, without really truly unpacking, or like being intentional, and being intentional about those changes that we've made. And so, when it's like, when we talk about diversity in church and we say, yes, we need to be a more diverse church, that's what it's going to look like at the end of times. All people will come in every nation. I'm terribly misquoting Revelation, I think. And and I think we hear that, I'm gonna go, okay, great, let's put that one Black or brown or other person on our staff, and let's put them in every type of promotional material and call it a day. Or let's promote that we have a one Spanish speaking church that meets in our basement on Sundays at 3. And look at us, we're diverse, y'all. And I think we're right. Like, it's like, okay, that was like bare minimum. And so how have we missed? I think we've missed the mark, and we continue to do so. And I say that as a woman who grew up in a denomination that is predominantly white, and knew that I was one of very few who looked like me and who spoke like me. And so, hoping that, this place that I had so much hope for, that raised me, and that, again, the other community that taught me what God was and who God is and the character of God, seeing that, being appreciative of that, while also seeing that there is still so much work to do, in this understanding of what we mean when we really say welcoming for all people, and what we mean when we say diversity. Because I don't think it means, again, going back to, are we willing to relinquish the power that we have in church that has historically been rooted in white supremacy? And so, yeah, again, back to the group chat, when I was like, what did y'all think of Encanto? And like, it was like, oh, they were trying, but they really missed the mark on it, right? Our Colombian friends said it was a very broad understanding of Latinidad within Colombian culture, when there were hardly any true representations of Colombian culture, and in one sense, like, I think that was on the mark, because I saw this movie, was like, oh, this is a very broad representation, and so so it was very broad, or sometimes representation gets oddly specific. And I see that in churches where it is very broad, where it's like, oh, look, we've got the 4 people of color here, and we're going to put them on the website, or very oddly specific, and say, here's one person in leadership, whether it is a lay person or staff person, and say, this is what this person thinks, therefore they represent all Latinas or Latinos, and they represent all Black people. And we know that's not true. And I think that's where the church is, where, when we don't truly, with intention, understand what it means to be a welcoming place.
Right. Yeah. We're gonna almost get there, but not really there. And I think it describes, and I don't know if it was you that wrote it in the article, but it's like, there's something off, right? It's like an aire that, like, we feel like, it's not really, Right. And
Yeah.
so I feel like that is something that you feel when you watch, for example, whether it's Encanto or where you step into a space that they're saying one thing, but it's not quite there. And
Mhm.
I think that, we all as humans in the world, can sense that. We can sense when someone's genuine or when something is genuine or something isn't. And I think that that's where a lot of disenchantment or a lot of these feelings come with the church or whatever it is. It's that
Yeah.
we're trying, or you're quote unquote trying, but there's something still off, and we're not going to fully feel fulfilled, or we're not going to fully feel the fullness of what this could be, if we're
Mhm.
just like just
Yeah.
just there. Okay, so the last question that I wanted to ask, well, it's not the last, but the last I will ask. Going back to what I was saying about this idea of abuelita theology or an abuelita faith, and I just loved, and I mentioned this earlier, but I just loved how abuela in the movie is a complicated character. We tend to romanticize um, our elders, or and maybe not always, but I will say that even in the writing of Abuelita Faith, I felt like that was something that I really wanted to wrestle with more.
Mhm.
But it's hard to when you're trying to also celebrate and honor our abuelas and the sort of the survival and all of these things that they have overcome. But also with that comes, because survival is complicated, with that comes yeah, just a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, and that is passed down to different generations. And so if you want to talk a little bit about sort of Abuela's relationship to her grandchildren and her children, and also I loved, I mentioned this earlier, but in the end how Abuela apologizes. I thought that that was so wonderful and such a Disney movie, because that is not reality all the time. So yeah, so if you want to talk about a little bit about how we see the complicated aspect of an abuelita theology or an abuelita faith in Encanto.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so the character of Abuelita's character, um I think, for when I had white friends who would talk about their nanas or their, GMAs or whatever they would call them. And that's not to make fun of the names. We have our own weird names for grandmas. Um, but it was always represented as this like kind, older, just spoiled, like the woman who would spoil you. And it's not to say that, abuelitas didn't do the same thing, but I think there was this sense of the there was just so much that they were unable to process um or didn't have the privilege of being able to process or relinquish. And yeah, so Abuelita just felt like so much more like a grandmother figure. Like it was well represented in this way that she is complex, that she comes with there's some hurt there, while also trying to raise a family and say, look at what we've created. This is so good. Um, and still not allowing herself to be happy about it. And I think she was such a great character. So I will fight anyone who calls her a villain, um, because I think she represents for a lot of us what our grandmothers and some of our mothers had to go through with being someone who had to deal with disruption in their life in in violent ways, and having almost no resources to do so, and so having to do it on her own, um, and then yet still continuing to try to make a life for her family. And so it's so interesting because you have Mirabel and Abuela are like the same person, right? Like both of them don't actually have gifts. Like they never mention that Abuela has a gift either. But she creates this family, right? And then Mirabel is this person who is, is her equal in a way. So if Abuela was the one who created it, Mirabel is the one that says, okay, now let's tend to this and let's see what, what we can continue to do. But I think in a way, abuelita is what happens when we don't allow ourselves to process the trauma that we have been through. And I think we've all seen it in our, in our own abuelas. And yeah, it's, I think she's a wonderful character who, you're right, in the end says, oh, maybe I did get something wrong and I'm sorry. Honestly, I low-key think somebody on that team must have been Latina and said, you know what, I'm gonna put this in there for the girls. Like I'm gonna say I'm sorry. Like Abuela's gonna say I'm sorry. And every grandchild of a first generation family is just gonna freaking lose it. They're gonna be like, this is what I needed. Because I think Abuela, and I see this with so many women, for the ones who were the first that had to do something, right? And then there's the next generation and then the one after, who then get to be the ones who get to thrive without having to deal with the same shit that the grandmother or the mother had to go through. And I see this with women in ministry, where they were the ones who were the pioneers, so that women my age and a little bit older and younger could say, oh, I didn't have to put up with, I could push back on, hey, that was sexist. Hey, I'm not going to do children's ministry because that's not my calling. Like there was just so many things that the pioneers had to do, the first had to do. And I think for those women who had to be the first, there's so much hurt that wasn't allowed to be processed, and we don't give them enough. Maybe they're not given the privilege of processing that and naming it. And so for Abuela to be able to do that because of Mirabel, that was
so healing.
Yeah, it was a healing moment to see that happen.
Right.
And so I think Mirabel and Abuela, I think they're the same person. And I think for Mirabel, and in a way, I mean, I don't know much about this. I just know this from like articles and TikToks about how you can tend to your inner child, right? And so I wonder if like Mirabel was Abuela's inner child, getting to be the fun one who celebrates her family, but then also says, I'm not fine. Right. And there's true hurt here. And so I need to deal with this because it's not doing me any good, because my light's fading if I don't. Yeah.
That's so good. Thank you so much for chatting with me and for just being such a wonderful person to think through this movie with and talk about this movie with, and for all the wonderful depth that you bring. So if you want to share, I don't know if folks want to read anything else that you've written or follow you anywhere, if you want to let them know.
Yeah. So I am a contributing writer for Good Faith Media. I write articles on everything from faith to movie reviews, and politics. And my current one my one that I'm working on right now is about the show Midnight Mass, which, oh my God. Yeah, so a whole lot to process there. Talk about some trauma. We're writing something about that, and you can follow me on Twitter at AA Aldape. That's my Twitter name, or that's my Twitter handle. I didn't come up with anything clever for it. I created Twitter in 2009, and I was very anxious, so I just used my email handle. I shouldn't probably say that either. Oops. But yeah, follow me there. And Kat, thank you for having me. And I love talking about Encanto and how it relates to all of us in different ways. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.